The night air in Seoul was sharp and cold, the kind that cuts right through a jacket and reminds you that winter has not finished with the city yet. Along the wide avenue outside the Grandeur Pavilion, one of the most exclusive private event venues in the entire country, a row of polished black SUVs and sleek foreign cars rolled in one by one, each carrying someone who believed they mattered. Red velvet ropes lined the entrance. Soft golden light poured from inside the building, warm and promising, as if whatever was happening beyond those glass doors was something rare. Because tonight, it was. The annual private gathering hosted by the Shinhan Circle, a collection of the city's wealthiest investors, developers, and power brokers, was considered the most important networking event of the year. Not because of the food, or the open bar, or even the live music drifting from inside. But because of who showed up. And who you were seen standing next to. 2 security staff stood at the entrance, checking names against a digital tablet. The first was tall with a sharp jaw and an earpiece clipped behind his ear. His name was Ryu Do-hyun, and he took his job very seriously in the way that some people do when their authority is limited to 6 feet of velvet rope. The second was younger, still adjusting the collar of his uniform as if he'd only recently been told what a formal event looked like. Cars continued to arrive. Guests drifted in through the glass doors. Air kisses and firm handshakes. The confident sound of heels on marble. The night was performing itself flawlessly. And then there was Nardos Bekele. She stood near the velvet rope holding a small white envelope, the kind that carried a personal invitation printed on thick cream-colored cardstock, the sort that was pressed, not printed, with weight and intention behind every letter. She was Ethiopian, 34 years old, and carried herself with the quiet steadiness of someone who had learned long ago that composure was more powerful than noise. Her dress was simple but deliberate, a deep burgundy wrap dress that moved gently in the evening wind. Her hair was natural, pulled back softly at the nape of her neck. Her jewelry was understated, small gold earrings shaped like circles, a thin gold bracelet on her right wrist that caught the light only if you looked carefully enough. She didn't look like she was trying to impress anyone. And that, apparently, was the problem. Ryu Do-hyun looked at her. Then he looked past her at the arriving guests behind her. Then he looked at her again, this time slower. His eyes moved from the envelope in her hand to her dress to her face, and something shifted in his expression that wasn't professionalism. It was judgment. Quiet and comfortable and entirely certain of itself. Name, he said flatly. Nardos Bekele, she said. Her Korean was clear and measured, learned from years of living and working in the city. He scrolled the tablet. Slowly. Then scrolled again. His eyes narrowed. I don't see it, he said. I was personally invited, Nardo said calmly, extending the envelope toward him. The invitation is right here. He barely looked at it. This event is for important guests, he said. The coldness in his voice was not accidental. It was deliberate. It landed exactly the way he intended it to. Behind Nardos, a cluster of arriving guests had slowed their pace. A woman in a silver gown leaned toward her companion and said something behind her palm. 2 older men near the rope exchanged a glance that carried something ugly in it. Light laughter drifted over from somewhere to the left, the kind of laughter that has a target. Nardos felt all of it. Every word, every glance, every quiet sound. But she kept her voice level. I understand, she said. But if you look at the invitation itself, you'll see the name of who sent it. The younger guard reached over and took the envelope from her hand. He opened it, looked at the card briefly, then turned to Ryu Do-hyun with an expression that was hard to read, somewhere between uncertainty and warning. Ryu Do-hyun barely acknowledged it. He took the card, looked at it for 2 seconds, and held it back toward Nardos with 2 fingers. The way someone returns something they've already decided doesn't count. We can't verify this, he said simply. Then call inside and confirm, Nardos said. We don't do that. A pause stretched between them, long enough for everyone nearby to hear the shape of what was happening. Then from behind, from a man in a tailored coat waiting to enter, came a comment offered without apology. She must be at the wrong place. Light laughter followed. Not from everyone. But from enough. Nardos did not react. She did not raise her voice. She did not lean across the rope to make her point louder. She took the invitation back, held it at her side, and stepped away from the rope. Not because she believed they were right. But because she understood something that most people in that space did not, that dignity does not require an audience to be real. She crossed the avenue slowly, stepped onto the opposite pavement, and stood beneath the amber glow of a streetlight. She looked down at the card in her hand. The name printed at the bottom was unmistakable. She had looked at it several times over the past week and still found something surprising about it, that after all this time, he had remembered. That he had reached out. She glanced at her phone. 8:47 in the evening. She thought about leaving. She was already calculating which direction the nearest subway station was, already composing the message she would send in the morning explaining that she hadn't been able to make it inside. And then the sound arrived before the cars did. A low, steady hum. Then headlights. Then the unmistakable procession of 4 matte black vehicles moving in tight formation down the avenue, not showy, not loud, but precise in the way that suggested something far more serious than status. The vehicles stopped in front of the grandeur pavilion. The security at the entrance stiffened immediately. Ryu Dohyun straightened his back in one sharp movement, as if someone had pulled a wire inside him. He spoke quietly into his earpiece. The younger guard beside him went completely still. The rear door of the second vehicle opened. And Kang Seo-jun stepped out. He was 32 years old, and nothing about him matched the stories people told about him. He wasn't loud. He wasn't large in the theatrical way powerful men sometimes are. He was lean and unhurried, dressed in a charcoal suit without a tie, his dark hair pushed back with the kind of effortlessness that didn't come from effort at all. His face was calm. Almost unreadable. The kind of calm that wasn't peace, it was control. The kind built over years, not inherited. 3 men flanked him as he stepped onto the pavement. The head of his personal security, a broad-shouldered man named Park Juno, fell into position 2 steps behind and slightly to the right. Seo-jun stopped. He looked at the entrance. Then at the guests clustered near the rope. Then, further than anyone expected, across the full width of the avenue to where the streetlight sat. And his eyes found Nardos standing alone beneath one of them. His expression didn't change dramatically. But something in it moved, barely visible unless you were paying very close attention. Something between recognition and anger, though the anger was the kind that doesn't show itself immediately. "Where is she?" he said. Not to anyone specific. Just out loud. As if the answer confirmed what he had already feared. Park Juno followed his gaze across the street and said nothing. Seo-jun was already walking. Inside the grandeur pavilion, the arrival of Kang Seo-jun's convoy had already been noticed through the tall glass windows. Whispers moved through the room the way they always do when a name carries weight. He actually came. He never comes to these things. Something important must be happening tonight. The event organizer, a polished woman named Shin Yejin, whose entire professional reputation rested on nights like this one going smoothly, received confirmation through her earpiece and immediately began moving toward the entrance to receive him properly. She had planned every detail of this evening with the precision of someone who understood that moments don't just happen, they are managed. The seating arrangement. The timing of the introductions. The brief, careful acknowledgement that Kang Seo-jun's presence lent this gathering a significance no other guest could provide. What she had not planned for was him walking in the opposite direction. Outside, the scene had already changed. Seo-jun crossed the avenue with his hands in his pockets, his stride unhurried but purposeful. He did not look back. His security team followed at a respectful distance. The guests near the rope watched in absolute silence, their conversation suspended mid-word. Ryu Dohyun stood rigid, the digital tablet in his hands suddenly feeling very heavy. Seo-jun stopped in front of Nardos. If you're enjoying this video, subscribe and comment to let us know where you're watching from. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. He looked at her the way no one else had looked at her all evening, not with assessment or curiosity or judgment. With recognition. With something that might have been apology, though his expression was too composed to confirm it directly. "Why are you standing out here?" he asked. His voice was low and even. He wasn't performing calm for the people watching from across the street. He was simply calm. Nardos looked at him for a moment. Then she gestured lightly toward the entrance. "They said they couldn't verify my invitation," she said. "I was told the event is for important guests." She said it plainly. No bitterness wrapped around the words. No drama folded between them. Just the facts, stated cleanly, the way she stated most things. Seo Jun turned his head slightly and looked across the street at the entrance. At Ryu Do-hyun, who was now standing at absolute attention. At the cluster of guests who had laughed 20 minutes ago and were now entirely still. He turned back to Nardos. "I sent that invitation myself," he said. "I know," she said. A brief pause settled between them. "Will you come in?" he asked. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a dramatic gesture designed for the audience watching from the rope. It was simply a question, one person asking another, with the weight of genuine asking behind it. And that, somehow, was the most powerful thing about it. Nardos looked at the invitation card in her hand one final time. Then she folded it gently and placed it into her small bag. "Yes," she said. They walked across the avenue together. The entrance area had gone completely silent. The guests near the rope stepped back instinctively, not because they were directed to, but because the energy of the moment required it. Ryu Do-hyun stepped forward with something that looked like professionalism but was actually very controlled panic. "Mr. Kong, welcome, we've been expecting." "She's my guest," Seo Jun said, not looking at him. 3 words. Flat. Clear. Carrying more consequence than a full speech ever could. He walked through the entrance with Nardos beside him, and behind them, the entire entrance staff stood in the quiet wreckage of what they had just done. The moment they stepped inside together, the grand hall shifted the way a room does when something unexpected walks into it. 300 guests. Round tables draped in white linen. Crystal chandeliers casting a warm ivory glow across everything. A string quartet playing near the back wall, filling the space with something elegant and understated. The air carrying the layered scent of expensive food and expensive cologne and the particular warmth of many people who believed they were exactly where they were supposed to be. And now, Kang Seo-jun, the most feared and least understood man in the room, walking alongside a woman that most of them had never seen before. Whispers followed like a second shadow. A woman near table 4 leaned toward her husband and murmured something urgent. He responded without looking away from Nardos. At the bar, a group of younger investors spoke behind lowered glasses. Near the stage, a property developer named Tae Sung-woo watched with narrowed eyes and said nothing, but his expression said enough. Shin Yejin approached them with a composed smile, though the composure was working extremely hard. "Mr. Kong," she said warmly. "We're so glad you could join us this evening. Please, let me show you to your table. We've arranged." "I'll find it," Seo Jun said. Not rudely. Just finally, in the way that closes a sentence permanently. Shin Yejin's smile held its shape by sheer professional will. She watched them move deeper into the hall and then turned immediately to the nearest staff member, speaking in a tight, urgent whisper. "Find out exactly what happened at the entrance. Everything. Now." At their table, set near the center of the room, which was the most visible position in the entire hall, Seo Jun pulled out a chair for Nardos without announcement. She sat. He sat across from her. A server appeared almost immediately with water, a menu, and the slightly nervous energy of someone who understood they were serving an important table. Around them, the pretense of normal conversation resumed. But eyes returned to their table again and again, like a compass needle that couldn't settle. Nardos picked up her water glass. She looked around the room once, slowly, taking in the architecture, the crowd, the quiet performance of wealth and importance playing out in every direction. Then she set her glass down and looked at Seo Jun directly. "You didn't have to walk over," she said. "I know," he said. "I was about to leave." I know that too, he said. That's why I walked over. She studied him for a moment. There was something in his expression, behind the controlled surface, that she recognized. Not from this evening. From much further back. You look different, she said. From what? From who you were the last time I saw you. He looked at her, and for just a second, the control eased slightly at the corners of his eyes. Different how? He asked. Nardos considered the word carefully before choosing it. Heavier, she said. He didn't answer immediately. He reached for his water glass, turned it once on the table with his fingertips. That's probably accurate, he said quietly. And in that small exchange, tucked between the chandeliers and the whispers and the 300 curious eyes, a thread was pulled between the present and a past that most people in this room would never know about. 7 years earlier, Kang Seo-jun had not been heavy. He had been 25, and he had been fracturing quietly in the way that people do when they are inside something larger than themselves and beginning to understand the shape of what it will cost them. The story of how he came to lead one of the most powerful criminal networks in Seoul was not a story about ambition. It was a story about inheritance, about being born into something and not knowing how to refuse it, surrounded by people who would not have allowed the refusal even if he had found the language for it. His father's name had opened doors and closed exits in equal measure. By 25, Seo-jun was already deep inside the machinery. But the machinery had not yet fully absorbed him. He had been in Addis Ababa for 3 weeks on a business arrangement that had fallen apart badly. Stranded in a city where no one knew his name or his family's name, with limited access to resources and a phone he was deliberately not answering, he had found himself sitting in a small cafe on a rainy Thursday afternoon, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone completely cold. He had not moved to get a fresh cup. He had not moved at all for nearly 20 minutes, and the rain against the cafe window was doing most of the thinking for him. Nardos had been at the table beside him, reading. She was not a social person by nature, she would tell you that herself without embarrassment, and with no apology attached. But she noticed the coffee. She noticed the way he was sitting, not relaxed, not tense, but held together in the particular way of someone using smaller muscles than the situation called for. She had looked over at him and said, simply, "Is the coffee bad or is it something else?" He had looked at her with the expression of someone who had not been asked a genuine question in a very long time. "Something else," he said. She had nodded once, as if that was a perfectly acceptable and complete answer, and returned to her book. But she ordered him a fresh cup. Quietly, through the server, without announcement or expectation. When it arrived and he looked up with slight confusion, she had simply turned a page and said, without looking up, "Cold coffee makes everything feel worse than it is." He had not known what to say to that. So he had said nothing. And somehow that had been the beginning of 4 hours of conversation that neither of them had planned. He had not told her everything, he never told anyone everything, and she had not asked him to. But she had a quality that was rarer than anything in that grand hall tonight. She listened without calculating. She asked questions without positioning them toward a desired answer. She offered her own opinions cleanly, without needing him to adopt them. At one point he had described his situation carefully, using deliberately vague language, and she had listened to the whole of it before speaking. "You know what your problem is?" she had said. He had waited. "You're making decisions based on what you owe people who will never stop adding to the debt," she said. "Loyalty is real. But loyalty that has no floor to it isn't loyalty. It's just ownership with a nicer name." He had sat with that sentence for a long time. When they parted that evening, she had given him her contact information, not as anything more than what it was, but the way someone gives directions to a person who looks genuinely lost. He had called once, about a year later, just to say that something she had told him had mattered to him. She had appreciated that. And then years had passed, and their worlds had moved in entirely different directions. She had returned to work that mattered to her, community development work across East Africa, then eventually Seoul, where she ran a small but respected organization focused on urban housing equity. Finding land. Securing funding. Navigating systems designed to make both difficult for people who had neither political connections nor generational wealth. He had become, quietly and completely, one of the most powerful and feared men in the city. He had never forgotten the cafe in Addis Ababa. The cold coffee. The book she was reading, something about urban planning that he hadn't understood but had found oddly grounding. The particular quality of someone who asked a real question and then waited for a real answer. When his assistant had flagged a charity benefit event connected to the kind of urban development work he had been quietly monitoring from a distance, he had done something unusual. He had written the invitation himself, on the good paper, and had it sent directly to her office. And tonight, standing in the middle of all this marble and chandelier light, he understood exactly why. Back in the hall, the event was continuing, but with a different undercurrent than it had started with. Shin Yejin had received the full report from her entrance staff and was now standing near the far wall having the quietest possible argument with Ryu Do-hyun. Her face was perfectly composed. Her eyes were not. "You didn't read the name at the bottom of the card," she said. "We couldn't fully verify." "His name is printed on it," she said. "His name. On the card. In your hand." Ryu Do-hyun had nothing useful to offer. Shin Yejin pressed 2 fingers briefly to her temple and then straightened. She looked across the hall toward Nardos and Seo Jun's table and then turned away, because looking at the problem didn't make it smaller. Meanwhile, several guests had already found reasons to drift toward that central table. A businesswoman named Osiora had seated herself nearby and was directing most of her conversation technically at both of them, but angling it exclusively towards Seo Jun in the practiced way of someone at a networking event who has identified the most important target in the room. Nardos noticed. She did not mind. She had spent enough time in rooms like this one to understand how the gravity worked, and she had no interest in competing with it. What she did not expect was Seo Jun doing something quiet but deliberate. Every time Osiora steered the conversation away from Nardos, and she did it 3 times, each time smoothly and almost invisibly, he steered it back. Not dramatically, but consistently. Actually, Nardos worked specifically with, and then he would look to her and let her speak. 3 times he did this. Each time it landed differently. Then the atmosphere in the room shifted. A man named Kwon Il-jin entered their orbit, mid-40s, property empire, a reputation for saying what other powerful people only allowed themselves to think. He was not speaking to their table directly. He was speaking to the adjacent table, but loudly enough to ensure his voice carried exactly as far as he intended it to. "These events lose meaning when the guest list isn't managed properly," he said, swirling the glass in his hand. "You start inviting random people and the whole atmosphere changes. What was that confusion at the entrance earlier?" He shook his head slowly. "That sort of thing shouldn't happen at something like this." The word random landed with precision. Quiet laughter from the table beside him. A nod from someone who should have known better. Seo Jun set his fork down. Not loudly. Not as a statement. He simply placed it on the edge of his plate, sat back slightly, and turned his attention toward Kwon Il-jin with the kind of stillness that doesn't happen by accident. Park Juno, positioned near the wall 12 feet away, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. The temperature at the surrounding tables dropped. Kwon Il-jin appeared to realize, gradually and uncomfortably, that what he had said was now sitting in open air in a way he hadn't fully considered. "Mr. Kwon," Seo Jun said. His voice was completely conversational. Not lowered, not raised. Just present. Kwon Il-jin turned. Produced a wide and uncertain smile. "Mr. Kong," he said. "Wonderful event tonight. The woman sitting beside me," Seo Jun said, "runs an organization that has rehoused over 2,000 families in the last 4 years. She has been published in 3 international development journals. The project she is currently building will directly influence urban housing policy in 2 cities." Silence. Not just at the adjacent table. At 3 or 4 surrounding ones, where ears had naturally tuned in the moment his voice carried. Seo Jun continued. "She was personally invited by me. And she was refused at the entrance tonight." He let that sit for the correct number of seconds. Not too many. Not too few. So when you talk about random people changing the atmosphere, he said calmly, I'd be careful about which direction you're aiming that. Kwan Iljan's smile dissolved cleanly. He nodded once with his mouth only, said something quietly that amounted to nothing, and moved away. At the table, the surrounding space felt different. Nardos looked at Seojun. He had already picked his fork back up and was looking at his plate with the same composed expression he'd worn all evening. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. I know, he said. A pause stretched between them. Thank you, she said. He glanced at her briefly. Don't thank me for something basic, he said. And somehow, those 5 words were more respectful than anything else that had happened to her all evening. The formal portion of the event began just after 9 o'clock. Shin Yejin took the stage with the practiced ease of someone who had stood in front of rooms like this one many times before. She welcomed the guests. Named the gathering's purpose. Acknowledged several important presences in the room. Then she paused in a way that felt unrehearsed, though everything she did was rehearsed. We are honored, she said carefully, to have Mr. Kang Seojun with us this evening. Measured applause. And, the second name added with the deliberate weight of someone correcting an error publicly, his distinguished guest, Ms. Nardos Bekele. Applause followed, less certain this time, the kind that follows a name the room doesn't yet know how to hold. But then Seojun stood up. Not in response to the introduction. Not to be introduced. He stood because he had something to say, and he chose to say it standing, which in a room like this one meant everyone else went quiet immediately. 300 people. The string quartet stopped. Even the servers near the walls went still. I want to say something briefly, he said. He looked across the room, not at any specific face, but at all of them. I've been in this city most of my life. I've built things. Made decisions. Accumulated resources. A pause that held the room entirely. Most of what I know about using those resources for something actually worth building, I learned from a conversation I had 7 years ago. In a small cafe in Addis Ababa. He turned slightly toward the table. From her. The room was completely still. She didn't know who I was. She didn't care who I was. She told me something honest at a moment when it would have been far easier to say nothing. And that kind of thing doesn't go away just because time passes. He looked at Nardos directly. Something real crossed his face, the kind that cannot be produced on purpose. She deserved to walk through that door tonight without question, he said. And I'm sorry she didn't. He sat back down. The silence held for a full second before the room responded, and when it did, it wasn't the polished applause of networking events and formal occasions. It was something less practiced. More genuine. The sound of people who had been reminded of something. Nardos sat very still. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was not someone who cried in public spaces, and she did not now. But something had moved inside her, something real and quiet and not connected to the applause or the room or who was watching. He had told the truth. About her. About himself. In a space where neither truth was required and both would cost something. That mattered in a way that no applause could equal. She looked at him when the room had settled back into itself. You could have just said she's a friend, she said. I could have, he agreed. Why didn't you? He considered for a moment. Because it wouldn't have been enough, he said. When the formal program ended and the evening relaxed back into movement, something had shifted permanently inside the hall. The guests who had watched Nardos being turned away at the entrance, or laughed, or looked elsewhere, or said nothing, now carried that knowledge about themselves in the private space behind their social expressions. Shin Yejin approached the table personally. Without the prepared smile this time. Without the organizational language. Ms. Bekele, she said. I owe you a direct apology for what happened tonight at the entrance. It was completely unacceptable. I take full responsibility. Nardos looked at her evenly. Thank you, she said. I appreciate that. Clean. Simple. No performance of forgiveness, because forgiveness wasn't a performance. No extraction of guilt beyond what the moment required. Shin Yejin nodded once and stepped away, carrying her reckoning with her quietly. Later, Seora returned, but differently this time, positioning herself toward Nardo specifically, asking direct questions about the housing project without routing everything back to Seojun. Nardos answered honestly, and found that underneath the social maneuvering, Seora had a genuine interest in development financing that turned out to be worth a real conversation. They spoke for 20 minutes. Exchanged cards. The evening had inverted itself completely. The person who had been refused at the door was now the most talked about presence in the room. Not because she had fought for recognition, or demanded it, or leveraged anyone's name to claim it. But because the room had been made to look at itself honestly. And this is what it had found. Just before 11, Seo Jun leaned slightly toward her. "Are you ready to leave?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Actually, yes." They walked out together, and the doors opened before them without hesitation.